difference makes it more clear what being the person really means. It's not one thing, it's two
Okay, so we all confabulate. We tell stories, some of which are true, about what we are now, what we were, and we're revising that constantly. And other people tell stories about us, or form hypotheses about us. That's true, I agree with that. So, how does that clarify what it is to be a person?
Being a person is actually two things. What I say about myself, and that includes narratives, false memories, calculations, what you like. And another thing, which is the basic phenomenal self about which James wrote, the ego self, I believe he called it, the subject self, which is also, I mentioned it before, Augustine's soul being present unto itself, which is also, as Faculdade argued, the sense of Locke's person. So it boils down to one thing. There is the first person self, which is the I inverse, I do, I believe, I remember. And another second person, a third person self, which is I know I have done that. And that is the narrative bit. So I really believe we are confusing things by not splitting those two very different senses of self. That's my problem.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I should say, by way of clarification, I think that in philosophy there are different things that people do. Some people present arguments to a conclusion, and that's a very common way of doing philosophy, but I think a very important kind of philosophy is the kind of philosophy that produces a gestalt shift, that people see the same things differently. So I think, potentially, the sort of things that Galen Strawson is saying could be a prod to reflect and see things differently. You know, the duck rabbit, you see it as a duck, well actually, now you can see it as a rabbit. I don't think this is the kind of thing where you can present a series of reasoned arguments very easily to that conclusion. It's just saying, I mean, it's an invitation to think about things in a different way. And I think it's very useful, and it's consistent with my own experience, certainly, of dealing with somebody who seemed, you know, other people were saying, well, it's all right because your mother's not there anymore. You know, well, actually she was. You know, that seems a really odd thing to say, but it's in one sense it's true, and in another sense it's not. And I think we need, as philosophers, to connect with real life cases like that. That's a future that most of us have ahead of us as well. We need to think about, at least in terms of our relatives and so on, but probably in terms of us, many of us will be heading towards that position. What do we think about that? If you see it coming, would it be better not to exist at all? Is dementia something to be terrified of because it's a loss of self, the loss of yourself as a person? Or is it just another natural continuity of you as a person that's not a particularly nice thing to experience? But it's not that you've lost your personhood. That's what I was trying to just prod towards. I haven't got, as I said, this isn't meant to be a coherent argument. But
it wasn't clear for me what do you tend to defend regarding this? So what do you think is responsible for the continuity of us as persons? Should it be this alternative of moral character?
Okay, so my own experience is I don't feel, I'm not as disconnected as Galen Strawson, but I don't feel a strong sense of being the same person through time. Like massively, like, you know, the assumption is that everybody, of course you know you're the same person you were as a child. Well, I've forgotten most of that. It may be influencing what I do dramatically. I'm not trying to defend a thesis, actually. What I'm trying to do is invite an exploration of ideas. People are misjudging me here. And particularly, nobody said anything about the resurrection of the body and stuff, because in a way that's meant to be a kind of, I call it genealogy light. But when you see where the idea has come from, you might be less persuaded by it. It doesn't follow. You can commit the genealogical fallacy of thinking that because something came from that, it still has the same properties as that. But it seems to be, it evolved as a solution to a weird sort of thing, and yet we got hooked up in it because Locke was such a persuasive writer, so imaginative with his thought experiments. He not only set the agenda in terms of consciousness, but he also set it in terms of exaggerated thought experiments. You know, the day and the night man who inhabit the same body. He imagined split personalities, consciousness in a little finger, all kinds of wild thought experiments, much wilder than Parfit's thought experiments. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah. I understood that your presentation was much around moral and judgment and sometimes spiritual and religious considerations. Do you feel that the steps that we are taking from conscious and self-knowledge should consider moral approaches as well, whatever moral might be?
Okay, I'm actually torn by the developments in psychology, which the more you know, the less room there is for proportioning blame and responsibility, basically. The more you know about causes of behaviour, about determinants of behaviour, determinants of what happens in the brain. If you believe the Libet experiments allegedly show that we start movements which we think of as intentional just before we actually have the conscious intention, which is as if our consciousness is a commentary on things we're actually already doing, rather than the causes of our behaviour. There are all kinds of suggestions that if you think logically about human behaviour and you want to blame people for what they do, what is this thing, this free will that they've got, this magical thing that allows them to get outside of the causal nexus and just sort of do something which was uncaused or do something which they can accept responsibility for? It's easier to explain it away, but on the other hand, there's a more humanistic tradition where we say, well, of course, people are people and human beings are responsible agents. We have to recognise that whole penumbra of emotional responses of guilt and freedom and blame that Peter Strawson, Galen Strawson's father, wrote so well about in what's that say, Freedom and Resentment. Is that what it's called? Freedom and Resentment. Very famous essay. So I'm completely torn on that. I don't know, I haven't got an answer for you. But I mean, this is the kind of artificiality of philosophy often, that if somebody gives a talk, they have to have a very clear line and explain it. I actually see philosophy as a dialogue. I mean, this may be odd, but I think philosophy is a dialogue, that we should be catalysts to each other's thought, and sometimes not having all the answers can be useful.
One more question.
I'd like to ask something, but I do clinical psychology for a few years, and during the entire day, this talk was one that I could relate to what I see occurring during the processes that people undergo in clinical psychology. Because when people are in pain or they are seeking change, they are not, they don't have this dialogue where they say, oh, my brain that produces my thoughts is not this and that. And, you know, sometimes they do, oh, I don't like my body, but it's not what triggers people, and it's not what we work on, and it's not the root of suffering. Even in cases of dementia and several scenarios that are possible. So, and on the other hand, we would be amazed with the extent of the possibility to manipulate whatever happens in our brain. We can do that, and we can do that with big numbers, really big numbers. We can change something, and that changes things in the brain, and it changes patterns of thought that are, I'm sorry to say, not so unique. They are quite common between us. So what is particular, and what takes people to counseling and to other processes, and what, even in cases of dementia, triggers suffering in people, is the question of knowing why do we want, what is the use of a certain pattern of thought, or what is the use of a certain body. So going back to your presentation, from a perspective of a clinical psychologist, the question would be, why would we want our entire bodies in that place, in heaven or hell? To do what? So I relate a lot with what you have said about Schrödinger, about moral and character. But during the processes of counseling, we don't call that moral or, well, because that has other aspects of it, but we call it agency.
Agency.
Exactly. So it's the question of knowing people, what we do in our work is sometimes we promote what we call second order changes, or we promote first order changes. Second order changes, or that means we change the way that the person attributes meaning to the events and how the person relates to the events, or we change the patterns of thought and the contents of thought. But why do we do that? Why do I change the pattern of thought, or why do I change the meaning? Because that person wants something, the agency part. And that the person doesn't go and ask, oh, could you please change my dualistic way of thinking, or can you please change my, the person, it's the agency. So yes, I agree with you, and the question is, do you agree with what I'm saying? I agree with you when you say perhaps what defines a person is patterns of behavior. Well, I might call it agency, and I agree with Nina, although I'm probably moral in my case and ethical, it's a broader discussion, but I can relate with that. If I think about myself, about my person as a clinical psychologist, so does that make sense to you? Do you relate to this? Or?
Well, I should add also that it seems to me that both Strawson and Schrödinger assert a position. There's not a huge amount, it seems to be illustration, and it's an assertion. It's a different way of looking at what it is to be a person, and it's a challenge to say what does. So the kind of evidence that Schrödinger uses seems to me to suffer from a lot of the kind of experimental philosophy problem that you just go out and ask what people's intuitions are about what it is to be a person, and lots of people say it's something to do with their moral character, something like that. And that doesn't seem to be, well, that might be quite a good way of deciding how people use words, but it may not actually reveal anything important about what it is to be a person. So if you get hung up on words, there's a problem there, but it seems to me that many people are looking in philosophy all the time for premises and conclusions, and you can follow this argument. And certainly with Strawson, and to some extent with Schrödinger, that isn't the case from what I've read. So it's just an invitation to see things differently. So